Main focus of the task. 1. Should be able to figure out the assembling order and the working procedures through reading drawings. 2. Should know the method and standard for cutting copper tubes. 3. Should know the method for bending copper tubes. Should be able to adjust the length of starting point. 4. Should know the method and the standard for expanding copper tubes. Please check the preparations and tools for this training. Precautions. When cutting a copper tube, it should be done through several trials to prevent distortions. When cutting, filing, or reaming a copper tube, make sure some metal crumbs do not go inside the tube. When removing debris from the tube, flow the nitrogen gas to blow them out. Do not blow them out with your mouth. The copper tube that will be used for piping should be straightened without any bent parts. When bending the tube, do it as slowly as possible so that it does not get distorted. Make sure a joining part of the tube maintains a circular shape without any dents. Trying to bend a tube with a single trial can easily cause several defects, making the bent part of the tube bursted or flattened. When measuring dimensions, take a measurement from the tube's end to its center, and from the tube's center to its end. When you put a mark on a copper tube after measuring, it should be drawn as thin as possible with a marking tool. The dimensions of the copper tube inserted into the part that is joined by a flare nut cannot be measured. It must first be joined into the flare nut and then cut according to dimensions on the drawings so that you can work without error. The flare nut cannot be fitted to the tube after it has been flared, so the flare nut should always be fitted to the right place on the tube before being flared. When expanding the tube, it should be expanded by applying forecut. Therefore, it is very important to fit the flare nut to the tube first and then cut the tube according to the dimensions through 4 to 5 time trials, not a single strong trial. When expanding the tube, it is necessary to turn the tube clockwise. If turned counterclockwise, the tube expander can get loose and then the tube might not be expanded completely. Please check what you are going to perform on this task. Performing tasks. Reading the drawings. Based on the given drawings, figure out what materials and components are required. Straighten the coiled copper tube in order to cut it as much as needed. Cut the copper tube longer than actually required to spare enough margin. Straighten the copper tube after cutting it so that it has no dents. When straightening the copper tube, make your arms at a right angle and press it down using your body weight as if pressing it down with your chest. To apply force evenly to the copper tube, rub it using the curve between index and middle finger on your palm. Reasons the copper tube needs to be straightened. All of the tubes and piping should remain vertical or horizontal. If the copper tube is not straightened, it is hard to maintain the tube vertically or horizontally when bending the tube. It can also cause a deformation, such as a distortion. The characteristics of copper tube used for the refrigerant piping. It has excellent corrosion resistance and durability. It reduces a friction loss due to its smooth interior. It has low scale formation. It is easy to fabricate or install piping due to its excellent ductility. It is thin and light-weighted, so it can reduce the weight of piping. It has a disadvantage of being easily dented by force as it is thin. Bending the copper tube. Take a measurement for part to be bent and put marks on the copper tube. When putting marks on the copper tube, it should be drawn as thin as possible to reduce error in dimension.
끝이 뾰족한 금긋기 도구를 사용해 마킹해 줍니다.
Match the marking point to the zero mark on the form wheel and the form lever of bender.
표시된 0점을 함께 일치시킵니다.
After that, bend the tube as much as the desired angle. When bending the copper tube into 90 degrees according to the drawing, a competitor should calculate the dimension of the part where the bending should be started. The competitor's current situation. The competitor puts a mark on the tube according to the dimension, 100 millimeters, shown in the drawing. The competitor matches the marking point to the zero marks on the bender and then bends the tube. After bending the tube into 90 degrees, the copper tube gets lengthened. The length of copper tube after bending, 124 millimeters. The bent part of tube gets lengthened as much as the radius of bender. Bender type. Elongated length depending on the bender type. 1/4 inch, 14 millimeters, 3/8 inch, 24 millimeters, 1/2 inch, 38 millimeters.
늘어나는 것을 확인할 수 있습니다.
To follow the dimension in the drawing, the starting point for bending should be adjusted to the resulting value of subtracting the radius of bender from the entire length. Entire length, 100 millimeters. Starting point for bending, marking point, equals entire length minus radius of bender.
4mm를 빼준 76mm가 됩니다. 이 마킹점을 밴딩기의 0 표시에 맞추어 밴딩해 주면 원하는 전체 치수를 맞출 수 있습니다.
When using the bender, it is easier to refer to the RL mark for the adjustment. L mark, stand for left. R mark, stand for right. If using the LR mark, there is no need to set any tolerance when bending the tube. Use the L mark if the end of the pipe, the point where you started measuring 100 millimeters, is on the left side. If you bend the tube after matching the point where you put a 100 millimeter mark to the L mark, it is possible to bend the tube into 90 degrees with a desired length along its central axis. Use the R mark if the end of the pipe, the point where you started measuring 100 millimeters, is on the right side. And make sure the point where you put a 100 millimeter mark is matched to the R mark when bending. The refrigerant piping should be bent so that no stress is caused at the connecting parts after installation. Trying to bend the tube with a single motion can easily cause several defects, making the bent part get dented or flattened. When bending the tube, do it as slowly as possible so that the tube does not get distorted. Make sure a joining part of the tube maintains a circular shape without any dents. If working with the typically used mechanical tube bender, you can bend the tube at various angles, 45 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 360 degrees, etc., and directions. Applying a tolerance when cutting the copper tube and giving a finish. When using a copper tube cutter, use your right hand to turn the handle clockwise and rotate the cutter from inside to outside for cutting the tube. Use your left hand to prevent the cutter from falling off the tube as it rotates around the tube. The copper tube used for the refrigerant piping is thin and light-weighted, so it is easily dented by force. Make several turns to cut the tube gradually instead of cutting it deeply with a single turn. Although the tube is cut successfully, there might be a little distortion and burrs around the cut edge. Remove all burrs and the distorted parts using a file and a reamer. Hold the copper tube above the tool to keep the removed burrs from getting into the tube. If some metal crumbs from cutting or filing, reaming procedure remains inside the tube, it might cause a resistance in the refrigerant flow or a blockage by debris. Flow the nitrogen gas to remove all the debris that might remain inside the tube.
제거합니다.
Flaring the tube. Trim the part to be flared with a reamer and a file. The two ends of the tube should be in perfect parallel to each other. What is the tube flaring? It is to form the end of the tube into a flared shape, and then connect the flare nut and the double nipple fittings together. The flare-shaped tube acts as a sealing, which enables the high-pressured airtight state maintained. It is always necessary to flare the bent tube after fitting the flare nut to it. This is because the flare nut cannot be fitted afterwards if the bent tube has already been flared. Insert the copper tube into the corresponding hole in the die block of the flaring tool. When inserting the tube into the hole, set 1/3 of the part where it will be flared to stick out of the block, and then tighten the tube so that it does not get slipped out. If the tube sticks too much out of the block, the diameter of the flare becomes too large, so the flare nut cannot be fitted. If the tube fails to stick out of the block, the diameter of the flare becomes too small, so the tube gets slipped out from the flare nut when tightening the flare nut. The flared part should be between 75% and 100% of its joining surface. Flare the tube rotating the handle of the flaring tool and drawing the cone of the flaring tool slowly into the end of the tube. If the flared surface is ragged or has some debris on it, there is a chance of leakage. Therefore, it is necessary to check how the flaring is done, the size of the flared part and any burst, and clean it well. Bring the flared surface to the double nipple fittings and then tighten the flare nut to connect them together. To prevent the leakage of refrigerant, the sealing oil should be applied to all the flared connecting parts of the piping before the final assembly. When tightening the flare nut, use adjustable wrenches to hold both the flare nut and the double nipple fittings at the same time. If you hold only one side, the other side, which is not fixed, could rotate along as you tighten, causing some distortions. Expanding the copper tube. What is the copper tube expansion? It is to expand a soft copper tube which has the same diameter as others to create a socket without using connecting bolts and nuts. It is commonly used in the field when connecting copper tubes to extend the length because there is no need to use any additional components. You can use a flaring tool for this expanding operation, but an expander can also be used. Bring the expander to a halt. Insert the copper tube into the first groove, slightly expanding the front part of the tube. Then, insert the tube all the way into the expander dice. Operate the expander over 3 to 4 time trials to create the socket part gradually. Slowly turn the copper tube clockwise to deliver the force evenly to the tube. If you try to expand the tube with a single strong movement, the end of the tube might be burst. If this happens, the tube cannot be connected to another tube. Regarding to the expansion length, the overlapped part should be longer than 1/2 of the tube's diameter for tubes to be connected safely. Checking dimensions after assembling pipes. Check whether the tube is bent according to the dimension in drawing. Check whether the joining part of the copper tube is brazed in a correct direction. Check whether any part of the tube is bent or dented. Check again the key points of the task we've worked on in this training. In this training, we have learned the refrigeration pipe manufacturing process. Everyone, thank you for your hard work.